What happens when a man with one of the most famous and powerful names in the world vanishes into one of its most remote and primitive corners? What if the vast fortune and influence of the Rockefeller family proved utterly useless against the secrets of a primeval jungle? This is the story of a modern heir lost to an ancient world, a mystery that pits the 20th century against the Stone Age. Our story centers on Michael Clark Rockefeller, the 23-year-old son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He was not a typical scion of wealth. A recent Harvard graduate, Michael was a passionate, adventurous, and sensitive young man with a deep fascination for anthropology and what was then called primitive art. He sought authenticity and meaning not in boardrooms, but in the furthest reaches of the globe. In 1961, his quest brought him to the Asmat region of what was then Dutch New Guinea, now a part of Indonesia. This was a land that time had seemingly forgotten, a sprawling riverine world of dense mangrove swamps, impenetrable jungles, and immense biodiversity. It was also home to the Asmat people, a collection of tribes renowned for their stunningly beautiful and deeply spiritual wood carvings. The Asmat were also known for something far more unsettling. They were warriors, and within their complex cosmology, head-hunting and ritual cannibalism had been central practices. These were not acts of random violence, but deeply symbolic rituals tied to their concepts of power, identity, and the spiritual balance of their world. To the Asmat, taking a head meant taking a name and an identity, absorbing the power of an enemy. Michael was on his second expedition to the region, collecting artifacts for his father's Museum of Primitive Art in New York. He was accompanied by a Dutch anthropologist named René Wozing. They traveled not in luxury, but as rough-and-tumble explorers, bartering with the villagers for their intricately carved bisque poles, shields, and drums. Michael was deeply respectful of the culture, but he was also driven by a collector's ambition. On November 19, 1961, the stage was set for tragedy. Michael and Wozing were traveling in a makeshift, overloaded catamaran, its twin hulls fashioned from dugout canoes and lashed together. As they attempted to cross the mouth of the Betsch River, the notoriously rough Arafura Sea lived up to its reputation. The water turned choppy, their engine died, and a sudden squall capsized their vessel. The two men found themselves clinging to the overturned hull, drifting helplessly out to sea. They were miles from the muddy, indistinct shoreline, a line of green that promised both salvation and unimaginable danger. After a night and a day adrift, watching the tide pull them further from land, Michael made a fateful and desperate decision. Believing the shore was about 3 to 5 miles away, Michael fashioned a makeshift flotation device, strapping 2 empty gasoline cans to his belt. He turned to Wozing and said, "I think I can make it." Despite Wozing's pleas to wait for a rescue that might never come, the young, athletic Rockefeller was resolute. He stripped down to his underwear, secured the cans, and began the long, arduous swim toward the distant jungle. René Wozing watched him go until he was a tiny speck, and then he was gone. The initial investigation began when René Wozing was spotted by a Dutch patrol plane the next day, and subsequently rescued. He recounted the harrowing story of the capsized boat and Michael's desperate swim for shore. The news sent a shockwave from the remote jungle all the way to the governor's mansion in New York. One of the world's most prominent families had lost a son. The search for Michael Rockefeller was one of the largest and most intensive in the history of the South Pacific. Nelson Rockefeller and his wife, Michael's mother, flew to New Guinea to oversee the operation. They chartered a Boeing 707 and brought in journalists, creating a media frenzy. The full weight of the Rockefeller name was brought to bear on the unforgiving landscape. The Dutch government deployed ships, planes, and helicopters. The Australian Navy sent vessels to scour the coastline. Thousands of local Asmat people in their own canoes joined the search, paddling through the labyrinthine network of rivers and swamps. For 9 days, they searched, a modern, high-tech operation against a terrain that swallowed sound and hid secrets. The challenges were immense. The Arafura Sea is teeming with sharks and saltwater crocodiles. The powerful currents could have dragged a swimmer for miles in any direction. If he did make it to shore, he would have faced a disorienting, endless mangrove swamp, a place of thick mud, malarial mosquitoes, and no fresh water. After an exhaustive but fruitless 9-day search, the Dutch authorities officially called it off. They concluded that Michael had drowned, his body lost to the sea. It was the most logical, simple, and least disturbing explanation. Nelson Rockefeller, with a heavy heart, held a press conference, thanked everyone for their efforts, and returned to New York. On paper, the case was closed. Michael Rockefeller was declared legally dead in 1964. But the rumors began almost immediately. Local officials, missionaries, and traders who knew the Asmat whispered a different, far darker story. They didn't believe a man as fit as Michael would have simply drowned. They believed he had made it to shore. And they believed that his arrival had coincided with a tragic and violent cycle of revenge. This is where the story turns from a tragic accident into a true crime mystery. The key to this alternative theory lies in an event that occurred 3 years earlier, in 1958. A Dutch colonial patrol, in a violent clash, had shot and killed 5 prominent men from the Asmat village of Otsjanep. This was a major disruption of the spiritual balance for the village. In Asmat culture, such a killing demanded a reciprocal act. To restore balance and honor, a white tribe man had to be killed in return. For 3 years, the warriors of Otsjanep had been waiting for an opportunity. The river and the sea were their territory, and they were patient. They were looking for a white man, any white man, to fall into their hands. The unofficial investigation began as soon as the official one ended. Journalists and adventurers, drawn by the allure of the Rockefeller name and the specter of cannibalism, traveled to the Asmat region to find the real story. One of the first was Milt Machlin, an editor for Argosy magazine, who in 1969 found compelling anecdotal evidence that Michael had been killed. Machlin spoke with Dutch missionaries who had lived in the region for years. These priests, who often served as confessors and confidants, had heard the stories from the Asmat people themselves. The story was consistent. A white man, matching Michael's description, had swum ashore near the village of Otsjanep, the very village whose men had been killed by the Dutch patrol. According to the whispers, the man was exhausted but alive when he was found by the warriors of Otsjanep. He was the answer to their 3-year-old problem. They had speared him, killed him on the beach, and then taken his body back to the village to be ritually dismembered and consumed. This act would have finally restored the balance that had been broken in 1958. The Dutch government, for its part, seemed to have known this was the likely truth. A secret report by a Dutch patrol officer sent to investigate just weeks after the disappearance concluded that Michael had been killed by the Otsjanep villagers. However, this report was buried. Admitting that the son of a prominent American governor had been killed and eaten by cannibals in their territory would have been a massive political and diplomatic disaster. For decades, the story remained in the realm of rumor and sensationalism. There was no physical proof, no body, no murder weapon. The Rockefeller family maintained a public silence, holding to the official drowning story. The world moved on, and the mystery of Michael Rockefeller became a kind of modern myth, a cautionary tale about the clash of civilizations. The breakthrough in this case was not a single discovery, but the painstaking work of an investigative journalist decades later. In 2012, writer Carl Hoffman traveled to the Asmat region, determined to find the truth. He did not go as a tourist. He lived in the villages, learned the language, and crucially, he understood the Asmat culture of storytelling and secrecy. Hoffman knew that the Asmat would not simply confess to a murder. The story was a dangerous secret, one they believed could bring reprisals even after 50 years. But he also knew that such a significant event would not be forgotten. It would be woven into the oral history of the people, told and retold in allegories and songs. Hoffman's pivotal moment came when he was in a canoe with an Asmat translator. The translator began to tell him a story he had heard his whole life, the story of the white man who was killed at Otsjanep. It wasn't presented as a confession, but as a known fact, a piece of local history. The men who did it were known. The reason for it was known. Hoffman was able to cross-reference these oral accounts. He spoke with the sons of the men who were allegedly involved. He pieced together the narrative that had been hidden in plain sight for half a century. The story was consistent. Michael Rockefeller, exhausted from his long swim, had washed ashore and was met by a group of about 50 warriors from Otsjanep. They initially helped him, but then one of the men whose father had been killed by the Dutch patrol in 1958 recognized the opportunity for revenge. He speared Michael in the ribs. The others then joined in, killing him. His body was taken into the jungle, where the complex rituals of headhunting and cannibalism were carried out over several days. The breakthrough was Hoffman's ability to finally document and publish this overwhelming body of oral evidence. His 2014 book, Savage Harvest, laid out the case in chilling detail. It provided the names, the motive, and the cultural context that had been missing for so long. It was as close to a definitive solution as the case had ever come. The immediate aftermath of Michael's disappearance was a profound personal tragedy for the Rockefeller family. Nelson Rockefeller reportedly spent a fortune on private investigators trying to find the truth long after the official search had ended. The loss of his son in such a mysterious way was a wound that never healed. For the Dutch government, the aftermath was a quiet cover-up. They promoted the drowning theory to avoid an international incident and to protect their colonial administration from scrutiny. The truth was deemed too shocking and too politically damaging to be made public. The official story of an accidental drowning became the accepted history. For the people of Otsjanep, the aftermath was 50 years of fear and secrecy. They believed that the power of the white man's ghost and the threat of reprisal hung over their village. A cholera epidemic that swept through the village years later was seen by some as retribution for the killing of Michael Rockefeller. Hoffman's book did not lead to any trials or legal consequences. All of the alleged participants were long dead. But it did change the narrative. It presented a powerful, evidence-based argument that shifted the likely cause of death from drowning to homicide, transforming a story of tragic adventure into a dark tale of cultural collision and revenge. The legacy of Michael Rockefeller is complex. On one hand, he is a symbol of a particular kind of naive Western ambition, a young man who ventured into a world he did not fully understand and paid the ultimate price. His story became a modern-day Icarus tale. On the other hand, his legacy lives on in the art he so passionately collected. The Michael C. Rockefeller Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York houses one of the world's most important collections of oceanic and African art. The very objects he was seeking on his final journey are now admired by millions, a testament to his vision and his passion. The case remains one of the 20th century's most compelling unsolved mysteries, primarily because of the lack of a body. Without forensic evidence, the story pieced together from oral history, however compelling, can never be proven with absolute scientific certainty. It remains a case built on whispers from the jungle. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about cultural relativism, colonialism, and the very nature of what we call civilization. Was Michael's death a savage act of cannibalism, or was it a predictable, ritualistic act of war, a response to a violent intrusion by an outside force? And so we are left with two starkly different images of a young man's final moments. Did Michael Rockefeller, his strength finally giving out, slip beneath the waves of the Arafura Sea, his body lost forever to the sharks and the tides? It is a lonely and tragic image. Or did he, against all odds, make it to the shore, only to find himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, the unwitting focus of a revenge cycle set in motion years before? It is a far more terrifying and complex end, a story that ensures his disappearance will forever be shrouded in the deep, dark, and enduring mystery of the Asmat.